I did like to voice my opinions in Bible study because I just like to ask questions. The pastor of that church was not a big fan of it. The way Paul may have felt when he's talking to this centurion, he's like, I know that I'm just a prisoner, but I'm trying to give you some really good advice. And the centurion's just kind of like, you're just kind of a prisoner, so I'm going to listen to the person who's actually operating the ship and who owns it, because that's who's most important right now. So I definitely know what it feels like to kind of say something to someone in a church environment, and then they kind of respond as if what you have to say is not important.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode in Bible Classroom. This is a solo episode today where Ashley walks through chapter 27 of the book of Acts. She focuses specifically on Paul under arrest as he's being carted from Jerusalem all the way to Rome in Italy. She particularly focuses in on how difficult that was for Paul and sort of the situation that he finds himself in, where he has to advise the commander of the ship in many ways, and how he responds is a way in which she has taken a lot for her own personal life and her own personal story. And she finds a lot of things that Paul does in this story that are really helpful for managing church relationships and how to best learn under leaders and how to sometimes challenge leaders. So yeah, I hope you enjoy.
Yeah, okay, so a summary for chapter Acts 27, since I'm not going to be reading it because it is super long. So this begins sort of like at the end of 26, where Paul wants to go to appeal to Caesar, so that he can go before Caesar and have a trial. And so because of that, they end up putting him on a ship to go to Italy, which, by the way, I'll talk about very briefly how in Acts 23 that could possibly be God, Paul fulfilling the will of God, because he gets sent an angel who says that he has to go and preach to the Gentiles in Rome, so it could be a fulfillment of that. So during this story, they get put on the ship, and it talks about this centurion named Julius, who shows Paul this kindness by allowing his friends to tend to his needs. So he's getting all this favor. But Paul also warns this centurion that this trip is going to be very dangerous. It is going to put their lives at risk, put the cargo and the ship at risk. And he advises him not to do it. But the centurion doesn't listen to him. He listens to the owner of the ship and the person who's the pilot of the ship, and they end up taking this very dangerous ship. And by the way, this there's a verse in this chapter that talks about the Day of Atonement, which is marking like the season that they were going through this going through this journey through. And it's a very dangerous time to be sailing. Like, a lot of people did not sail during this time because the seas are really high. It was really rough weather. It was around the season between September and November where this was taking place, because it talks about the day after Atonement and how it was just a very dangerous time for people to be sailing. It wasn't a good idea to do it, but the centurion makes the decision to do so anyway. They run into a lot of difficulties. They end up changing ships a couple of times in order to get to Italy, and then eventually a really big storm hits, and they just gets to a point where they end up throwing things overboard. They throw the tackle overboard, the cargo overboard. They haven't been eating for about 2 weeks, and at this point they kind of like abandon all hope. But then Paul gives them this message saying that, that we are going to live, we're going to survive. He encourages to eat the food that they have left so that they can have strength to survive. And at the end of all that, the ship ends up breaking apart completely, and they end up having to swim and, anchor to shore, which they make it there safely. And then I go into the very beginning of Acts 28, where they end up on this island called Malta, and they meet these kind people who are sort of judgmental towards Paul at first, because the snake comes out of the fire, bites his hand. But then they find out that he actually doesn't die from it, so they think he's a god. And then we go through this very short story of how they're given all the supplies that they needed and lost on this ship. And so God basically restores what they need and keeps them alive. So I just wanted to start off with that and then go into the teaching. So when I was reading through the book of Acts 27, or chapter Acts 27 and up to 28, I really wanted to read it because I do like the sound of reading it, but it's just too long. It's a really long chapter, at least 27 is. And so I'm not going to read the whole entire thing. I'm just going to kind of talk about those different parts that I thought were really interesting, that relevant to the topic, because I wanted to talk about this idea of how difficult it is to work with others, like the wonderful thing of working with others, but also this difficulty of being around other people. And that's not just in the church, because it can be in the church, because I've had some difficult experiences like that, which I'll talk about a little bit. I've also had difficult experiences working with others in work and family and all that kind of stuff. So it's just this idea of whether we're in the kingdom of heaven or not, like working with people is very difficult, and entering into the kingdom of heaven does not make it less difficult to work for people. It just makes us have to look at people differently while we're dealing with those difficulties. And so the first thing that I want to talk about was there's this section here in Acts 27 where Paul is warning the centurion, because the centurion is the one who has the most authority on this ship, and he's telling him that this is a really bad idea to go on this journey, because our lives are going to get put at risk, the ship's going to get put at risk, the cargo's going to get put at risk, so we should not be doing this. And so it says the centurion basically ignores Paul and listens to the sailor and the owner of the ship. And it got me thinking about how when we're in groups of people that sometimes we can be ignored because we're not as important as others, or sometimes people just think you're ignorant about what's going on, so they just don't pay you any attention. And I was thinking about my experiences with that in church. There was a church that I was previously a part of, and I know that I was a pretty outspoken person. I wasn't rude or anything, not intentionally, but I did like to voice my opinions in Bible study, because I just like to ask questions, and I like to talk a lot, and I like to give ideas, or, I just wanted to share information. That's just what I was about. I liked people giving me information and giving it back to them. And some people, even the pastor of that church, was not a big fan of it, because even when we would be in discussions where we would talk about things that everybody should have the freedom to say things about, and if I asked a question or made a comment, it was sort of like you should probably talk less and be quiet, and kind of like let other people do the talking, like let the men do the talking, let me do the talking kind of thing. And it bothered me for a long time, and it took me like a couple years to kind of get fed up with that, and then eventually have the courage to kind of tell him, like, I just felt like you were being rude and so mean, and that conversation did not go very well. So with that being said, I'm not there anymore. But so I definitely know what it feels like to kind of say something to someone in a church environment, and then they kind of respond as if what you have to say is not important, or you need to be quiet and kind of let me finish talking. And so that does not feel very good. And I'm sure a lot of women have experienced that. I've also had that kind of experience with jobs, not to that degree, but, I worked at a previous company, and it was a startup. It was his first brick and mortar location, and he was very obsessed with making money, for sure. He definitely did not have the manpower or the resources to do what he needed to do. And I would try to give him the advice of not taking on too much, because he was making a lot of customers angry, because he was starting projects, not finishing, taking money from them, and would not complete the work because he did not have the time or the resources to do it. And he just sort of like, wasn't a big deal, because in his mind, more project meant more money. And his wife actually told him the same thing, and he wouldn't listen to her either, which was one of the reasons why his business was not doing so well. But, that's another story. But, so I definitely had that feeling of the way Paul may have felt when he's talking to this centurion. He's like, I know that I'm just a prisoner, but I'm trying to give you some really good advice. And the centurion's just kind of like, because he was very kind to Paul, but it was like one of those moments where you're just kind of a prisoner, so I'm going to listen to the person who's actually operating the ship and who owns it, because that's who's most important right now. And that does not go very well when you get down into the story. But another thing I want to talk about with working with others that you see in this story is that people can be very selfish and unfair. And you kind of see that when you look at the story of Acts 27, and you see these sailors who are pretending like they're lowering down an anchor to kind of get the ship stable, but they're actually lowering down a boat so they can escape. And then Paul's like, well, if those sailors leave, then we're all going to die, so you need to get them to stay. And, I've had experiences like that in church where people kind of just don't want to like carry the weight. If the work is too hard, they want to leave. They don't want to carry their weight, so others have to do things they aren't good at or have the capacity to do to get it done. Like if it doesn't benefit them, they want nothing to do with it. Like they don't want to make sacrifices. They make things difficult for others. And granted, this is a very life-threatening situation for all of them, but that was kind of the key, that it's a life-threatening situation for all of them, not just for those group of people. And instead of coming together to figure out what's best for everyone, they were just thinking about themselves. And it kind of reminded me when I did work at this other church in ministry, and how I got the opportunity to work in finances, which is not what I wanted to do. Numbers is not my strong suit. I know the basic stuff of it, but it's not like, it wasn't my strong suit. It was kind of like one of those things that I did because nobody else was going to do it. And so when we would have meetings in our young adult ministry, people had a lot of questions. They were super angry about the way money was being spent. And, sometimes they would ask me certain things, and I would go to whatever leader I need to talk to, and I couldn't get the right information, maybe because they didn't trust me with it or something. And then I would go back to them and they were just like, why is our money being spent for this? Like, why can't we have our own bank account? Why? Like all these different questions that I couldn't answer because I'm like, I'm not the right person to be doing this. And when I talked to the person who is the leader of our young adult ministry, he basically was just like, there are people here in this church who can do this job and they can do it very well, but they're not willing to do it. So sometimes people get put in positions where they have to take on things they're not very good at, so he was just like, being encouraging, like, I know that this isn't what you want to do, but it's not your fault. It's just because there's somebody out there who can do it right, but they're just refusing not to do it. And sometimes that can create burdens. We've also had the issues of, people making selfish, like rude comments online and offending people from other churches. And then they had a meeting and had to ask someone to, unfortunately, leave the group. I was not there for that discussion because I was out of town, but it's like that kind of stuff happens even in church environments. You have to have hard conversations with people. You get put in awkward positions, and it's just very, very difficult, and so, that's what it's like to work with other people. And I'm not trying to talk down to church. It's not churches that are bad. It's just people who are flawed. And so we have to learn how to respond to people's flaws differently. And so that's when I started thinking about the benefit of working with others and the benefit of even them being on this ship together. Like Proverbs 14:4 says, where there are no oxen, the manger is clean, but abundant crops come by the strength of the ox. So it's like this idea that if no work is being done, then of course everything is clean, nothing messy is going on because nothing is being done. But when people come together, just like when oxen come together and they work, there's a big mess that gets created, and people create big messes when they come together. Even when they're accomplishing something, things can get messy because work is being done. And so thinking about this centurion Julius, who showed Paul kindness and letting him go to his friends in order for them to take care of his needs. Like if that centurion had not been there, like who would have shown Paul that kindness? Or Paul being there in general was very beneficial to all of them. He was the most beneficial person there, if you ask me, because he prophesied to them about the danger of the voyage. Even when they didn't listen, he encouraged them with another prophecy when the ship started to go really downhill, and he encouraged them that they were going to live. And he also prevented the sailors from leaving the ship so that they could all survive. If Paul had not been there, he was the one that basically got them to their destination safely because of the prophetic gift that he had, and also because God wanted him to get to Caesar. So he had to save them all in order to save Paul. And even the centurion, he found the Alexandria ship for them to get on so they can get to Italy. Like there are people who in your group who have connections that you don't have that can make things easier for people. They can bring in resources, they can bring in finances, they can bring in spiritual guidance. There was a pilot on board who steered the ship. Like those simple things that we don't think matters actually do matter when you don't have it. So working with people can get messy, but we need those people's gifts even if we don't like them. So we have to learn how to see them the way that God sees us and not the way our flesh sees them. And that can be hard to do, but it's the idea that sometimes, yes, it's healthy to leave a situation, but no matter what situation you're in, no matter what work environment you're a part of, no matter what church you're a part of, there's going to be some level of difficulty. And sometimes you have to not let the good be uprooted from the bad. And I was thinking also about how God sees us and how we should do that. And it reminds me of Matthew 13:14, where it says, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. And I never saw it this way, but there was this verse was interpreted by a pastor, and I never saw it this way until he said it. And it's actually a really good interpretation, in my opinion, is that he's looking at this as like people, like in this parable, like this treasure is like the good thing inside of people, and then this field is like all the dirty things about them. And so this man that goes and finds it and covers it up could be like God, but it could also be us. But it's like this idea that when you're working with other people, like when you're accepting them, you're not just accepting the good, you're accepting the bad things about them. And so you're not just getting a treasure, you're also getting a field that's filled up with dirt, weeds, whatever you want to call it. And so you have to learn how to deal with both, because in order to get that treasure, you have to get that field, and that's what God does for us. Like he understands the good things and the bad things about us, and he doesn't allow that bad to outweigh the good. He finds it to work to his benefit. And it also reminds me of Matthew, and I will read this. Matthew 13:24 through 30. Let's see. And I'll just pull that up and I'll just read that because it's not that long. But this is the parable of the weeds. And he says, he put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, An enemy has done this. So the servant said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, No, lest in gathering the weeds, you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Gather the weeds first, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. So it's like the idea that there are, even though it's good to remove the bad, like removing the bad can cause good things to remove too. So you can't always displace people from your life or remove yourself from situations because you're also removing something good. And you just have to make a wise decision about whether or not it's worth it to do something like that. And of course, like I talked about, like I felt like it was the right time for me to leave that church. It was also the right time for me to leave that job, and I have a much better one now. So it's like this idea that sometimes you have to leave there, but I didn't leave right away. You know, I stayed there and tried to make it work. And when it stopped working, I realized that and I had to go. But it's this idea that you can't just run out every time things get difficult, like, because people are just naturally difficult at some point, at some season in their life. And if you're uprooting the bad to get rid of them or to remove yourself, sometimes you uproot that good. So I just wanted to get that idea in your minds. And so I also wanted to talk about this other aspect that I saw on this ship about the idea of just suffering with Christ. And the interesting thing is that their journey began by sailing in a ship, and I will try to pronounce this as best as I can, but I think it's called Adramatium. But basically that means I shall abide in death. And so that's not the kind of thing that people want to do. Like when you're going on a journey, whether it's on a literal ship or a spiritual journey, you don't want to have this idea of abiding in death because people don't want to do that. They want to steer clear of it. But the interesting thing about that is that after it talks about the name of the ship, it talks about how they sailed under a lee called Cyprus. And so the Cyprus in Greek means like love, like a blossom of love. And so it made me think about how even when we are going through a season of death or like a hypothetical kind of death, that we're always under the covering of love, even if we're going through hardship. And there's lots of verses in the Bible that talk about this comparison of suffering, but then also comfort. Like 2 Corinthians 1:5 says, For as we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. Psalm 23:4, this is like one of the more common ones we quote. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Even in this chapter in Acts 27, verse 20 says, When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. And so I put that last one in there because, God dwells in the darkness too, because we think of God just being in the light, and he is there, but he's also surrounded by darkness. God is also associated with clouds and thick darkness. Like Psalms 97:2 says, clouds and thick darkness are all around him. So sometimes we come into dark seasons, and that's the very place that God is in because he dwells in darkness. And I don't think that we often think about God that way, not because he's, bad or evil or anything. It's just because he dwells in storms. Like storms is like a normal place for God to be because that's just a part of his nature. So sometimes we come into storms like they are on this stormy sea in this terrible weather, but yet they were still in the midst of God. And sometimes we have to deal with like the hardship of waiting to get through difficulties. And I thought it was interesting that this fast, the Day of Atonement, is mentioned here. Now, the Day of Atonement is brought up down here in verse 9 in Acts 27 as sort of like a time, like a season marker, because it talks about how this journey took place after the Day of Atonement. So the Day of Atonement took place on the 10th day of the 7th month, and in the Hebrew calendar that's called Tishrei, and they were not allowed to eat or do any work, and this was brought up basically to mark the season that they were sailing. And so this took place in what we know to be the month of October, because I think it's easier just to bring that up instead of using Hebrew calendar words. And so dangerous seasons for sailing during that time would begin in September and last through November. And most navigation on the sea would come to an end until winter was over. But the crew that Paul was with did not wait until that dangerous season was over. So it's basically set there as a time marker. And the ironic thing about that is that Paul criticizes them by basically saying, I told you that sailing right now was a bad idea. But the whole reason they were on the boat is because in the previous chapter in Acts 26, Paul decides to appeal to Caesar when he stands before King Agrippa. So they decided to send him to Italy. So the whole reason that they're on the ship anyway is because they've been ordered to take Paul to Italy. So they have to go. And so I was thinking about, that the idea of the Day of Atonement, of fasting in this difficult situation they were in, and how these are all different groups of people. Like, there are people who are on the ship who are, some of them are Jews, some of them are Gentiles, like some are prisoners, one is a centurion. Like, people come from different positions and different places in their life. They're different races, but at the same time, it's like they're all suffering in the same exact way. And I think that suffering and affliction is a great equalizer. Just like fasting causes affliction, but this hardship also is equalizing them because they're working together on the ship and they're suffering together. And so that pain creates some type of common ground. And so that one decision that's made by Paul to appeal to Caesar, and this one decision by the centurion to continue on this dangerous journey, put them all in the same afflicting situation. And so when we work in groups, one person does affect everyone else. Like, one person's decision affects everybody else, because it's either going to make things better or make things worse for those people in that group. And it reminds me of how 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And so they were all weak, and they all lost strength together due to a lack of food for 2 weeks. So they were all suffering in the same way, despite the fact that they came from different backgrounds. And I think that kind of unified them all together. Even with the sailors trying to leave the ship, there was still unity in that, because Paul was like, if they leave the ship, then we're going to die. So they had to come back. So it was like this idea that at any point in time, like, we can all suffer as this group, but we're all doing it together. And it was the thing that them being together was the thing that got them through, but not them separating from one another. And so, but the idea is also that suffering with God is valuable, because, everybody suffers whether they're a Christian or not, but suffering with God takes it to a whole nother level because there's purpose to that. And so despite the decision that was made by Paul to appeal to Caesar, despite the decision that the centurion made to sail in a dangerous season, God still had a plan in mind for that. And maybe Paul appealed to Caesar as a way of fulfilling the word of God that was spoken to him. God told Paul that he had to testify in Rome in Acts 23:11. And maybe he also knew he could never stand a fair trial in Jerusalem because they were plotting against him, and he did it also to save his life. Because that was something that Paul would often do. He would use his Roman citizenship to spare his life or to stop punishment from happening to him. So maybe that was his way of, I'm going to appeal to Caesar to stop myself from going to Jerusalem and having an unfair trial and end up getting executed or going to jail. But it was the fact that Paul was on that ship what was the thing that saved them. And it kind of reminds me of the story of Jonah. And this seemed very similar to me. Like, Jonah is on this ship of people, and he's sort of steering away from the will of God, which is kind of what you see happening at the beginning of the story in Acts 27, where Paul is speaking to them, and he's speaking basically prophetically, and he's like, this is not going to go well. We don't need to travel now. And they basically ignore him, and they just continue to go on their journey anyway. And so Jonah is doing sort of the same thing. Like, he's standing against God's will, and he's like, I'm not going to go to Nineveh to talk to the Assyrians. I'm just going to go and run away. So they both end up on the storm on the sea, and they end up casting lots. For Jonah, in Jonah's story, they cast lots to figure out who was causing this terrible storm, and they cast lots. It falls on Jonah, so they toss him overboard. And I think the interesting thing is, like, the reason that they were going through this storm, was because they made this bad decision, but they were alive because of Paul, versus the other story where they were having this terrible storm because of Jonah, and they had to toss him overboard to be relieved. But I think the thing with Paul is that they couldn't toss him overboard because that was the thing that was saving him, because towards the end of this story, you have Paul who's prophesying to them at the end of this 2 weeks after they've been fasting, well, not fasting, but basically starving for 14 days. And he basically tells them that, God basically tells him, like, you have to go to Italy, so I'm going to spare your life and spare the lives of everyone on the ship. And so it's like this idea that even though they were both sort of coming against the will of God, because Paul, who was there, who was the main man who was in the will of God, because he was doing the right thing, like, they ended up getting spared because of what Paul did. So Paul was their saving grace, even though they were on the storm. Now, this other person, Jonah, even though everything works out in that story, it's the idea that he was completely running away. He was the man of God who was running away from the will of God, and that put them all in danger. So they had to get rid of him. They couldn't get rid of Paul because he was still standing in that will, even though other people who were higher than him made a different decision that was affecting all of them in a negative way. And so it's like this idea that sometimes the members of your group are like your saving grace, and they may not literally save your life, but it may be something about them that God is using to protect you from, because God is protecting them, and that protection is causing some type of protection in your life, or their increase is causing increase in your life. Because I'm sure that you all have encountered other people who have been blessed, and that blessing has spilled over into your life. And that's how I think of working in groups. It's like negativity can spill over from other people in your life, but then blessings can also spill over from having connections in your life. And you never know, like, how God is going to use somebody else to save you. So you kind of have to be careful, like, who you try to get rid of or who you try to cut people off, because, things may not be perfect, but you never know if God is going to use that person to save you from some manner of trouble or some issue that you have in your life. And so enough talking about that. So we're going to get into Acts 28. And so I'm only going to do the first part where we talk about Malta. And that one is kind of short. I can kind of read that one. The other one was too long. I didn't want to get in too deep into that one because it would have taken me forever to read it. So I'll go back and I'll read over that. So I'm only going to be reading down to verse 10, where it says, "After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and was cold. And Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire. A viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, 'No doubt this man is a murderer, though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live.' He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery. And Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed." And so that's a very interesting story, a very big turn of events. And it kind of reminded me another thing about working with people. And this is another bad thing, is that how fickle people can be. And so, and so I was reading, and sometimes I don't read from the Message Bible all the time, but I think it's really, really good when you're teaching. And I like what it said in Isaiah 51:7-8. And it says, "Listen now, you who know right from wrong. You who hold my teaching inside you, pay no attention to insults, and when mocked, don't let it get you down. Those insults and mockeries are moth-eaten, from brains that are termite-ridden. But my setting things right lasts. My salvation goes on and on and on." So it's this idea that people who talk negatively about you, what they have to say is temporary. It's all going to die out. And I think I had brought this up on the podcast I do with Noah, but it's this idea that we think that the things that people say last forever, like the things that get posted on the internet and stuff like that, we think that's going to last forever. And it's well, maybe not forever because we don't know what exactly is going to happen when God comes and everything, heaven and earth, gets wiped away. And there's a whole new system that is set in place that is under Jesus Christ. And so it's this idea that everything that people say about you that is negative it's all temporary. You know what I mean? Because people have these fickle ideas, because people like to talk about circumstances. People get caught up in circumstances. They like for things to look a certain way on the outside without considering the fact of who you are and your identity and where you stand with God, So it's this idea that who cares what people have to say when they're talking about you? Because sometimes the people that say things about you, they don't really know who you are. They don't actually know who you are. Just these people didn't know who Paul was. They thought he was a murderer in 1 minute, and in the same exact minute they thought he was a god because he didn't get injured. And so it's this idea that people who talk about you in that way, they don't even know who you are. They don't know who your standing is, and people change their opinions based on circumstances. And I think that's exactly why God wants us to look upwards and focus our attention on things that are eternal, because everything changes. And so, I just wanted to put that out there because I thought that was just so important to me. And so it's also the idea of, you see God's increase happen in this very short story of 10 verses. In Acts 27, because the storm was so bad, they had to get rid of the cargo and the tackle. And towards the end, they even had to start throwing out some of the food that they were saving. And, sometimes God puts us through storms to get rid of stuff that we don't really need. Sometimes God puts us through things that gets rid of unhealthy habits or bad attitudes, bad character traits, even some people we don't need in our lives. And I think that we think that those things are things that we need, but then God is trying to get rid of those things so he can make room for better things in another season. And so we think we're losing valuable stuff or just making room for something better. And so you can't always keep what you're used to having, because it doesn't leave room for a greater blessing. And so Paul and this crew lost everything. They almost lost their lives, which they did not, thank God. But then they lost their ship. They lost all their cargo. They lost all their food. They didn't have anything. They ended up on an island, but then God put them in a position where they were around very kind people who were willingly sharing their resources. And at the end of it, they ended up giving them everything that they needed for free. They were just those kind of people. Not to mention that because Paul was acting in the will of God and he was healing these people and, just creating miracles in their lives, it was all the more reason for them to give, because he was giving them something more valuable than just stuff. He was giving them the miracle of God. And so it's this idea that no matter what we feel like we're losing during that season, that God has something better in mind. Like, not only is he going to restore us, but he's going to give us something better, which kind of reminds you of that story of Job. Like, Job literally lost everything except his life, and then he ends up getting, was it like a sevenfold? Was it sevenfold that he got back? But he got like this great increase. And so it's just, we think that we're losing things, and all God is doing is just making room for something better. So, I mean, yeah, that was pretty much all I had to say. And, I just hope that you all learned something from that. And so if you guys have any questions or make any comments or